I am Jorius.
And I'm Silas.
This is Hermetic Link. And we're going to start at the beginning. This is going to be our introductory episode here. And we're going to entertain the biggest questions that newcomers to mystic thought are.
And this includes subjects like Hermeticism, Enlightenment, heavy on the magick, and newcomers, intermediates, and adepts alike, as well as maybe just the intellectually curious are sure to find value. This is going to be mixed in with a lot of personal experience, because it's one thing to read about these kinds of things, it's another thing to kind of live an experience revolving around magic. That's what that's a gap that I feel like personally I really want to nail, with the personal touch of having an experience behind it. And I'm excited to talk about anything and everything having to do with magic.
So, from childhood, we tend to have these really big questions coming out of the gate.
Yeah, it was, I feel like kids these days often are thinking about things that ordinarily you wouldn't think that they would, but I can remember from a very, very young age, there were doubts about Orthodox Christianity, and I think you know a little bit more about this than I do, because I was always an outsider looking into Christianity, and even when I was in Christianity at a very, very young age, my family was so casual about it. I can't even say that I have a very intimate experience with the church, but one thing I will say is that if I was going to be raised in and depart from anything, it would probably be witchcraft itself, because my family does have a bit of a lineage and a bit of a history, even to present day, of witchcraft. And I don't really go into much of like natural witchcraft. I feel like that differs a little bit from my new personal engagements. But there's certainly a lot of value, and I can't say that I'm not absolutely curious about it now, having learned more about my own field, then seeing later the nuances that maybe like what we label as neo-pagan, or, you know, I hate when people call it witchy.
Yeah.
Because it's a craft to be respected, for sure. There's a lot of nuances, and there's, I would say, enlightenment to be had.
I would say, as a broad term, as an umbrella term, I would call it Hermeticism. And it's on the same scale as the Orthodox traditional religions, but we don't really recognize it like that because it's been stomped out so many times throughout history.
Yes, that's something I want to help a lot with. I feel like when you're tackling Hermeticism, or the lifestyle that is mysticism, I think that as far as the chain of mysticism goes, it's something that happens whether you want it to or not, or whether an established religion wants it to or not. It's almost like a force of nature in that way. But
yeah,
yes,
it's like a flowing process.
Yeah, and as far as the traditions go, you're not going to find a very voluminous text collection about it, besides what's dug up every now and then, as compared to more orthodox religions. Because honestly, this is on the Catholic Church way back in the medieval period, and a little bit before that. I'd say like a short while after the establishment of Orthodox Christianity, when those traditions started branching out into different things, they started having a lot of problems with a lot of the texts and a lot of the information that people like you and I personally would probably find very, very useful. And it's easy to get angry about that because you think like lots of people mourn the loss of so much history. They did a very thorough job as far as scorched earth solutions goes, as far as book burnings, anything that had to do with magical or hermetic traditions. And it's not to say that like a lot of it didn't live on even enough for us to have a fully constructed pillar of tradition for it, but there's definitely a lot that the people did not have the freedom to express from the medieval period up until only modern, very modern history was it very much acceptable to even entertain these things.
And I think the internet is probably one of the biggest conduits for that sort of, well, we'll say, quote unquote, new information to come to light.
I agree. Yeah, I was telling you about this. I don't think that there's a way that you could impact the current corpus of hermetic knowledge or anything having to do with magic without having a huge impact. And I say that because of something resembling the butterfly effect. We were talking about how the internet is single-handedly kind of launching these traditions into a sort of new golden age where it's absolutely flooded. Like the floodgates of information are open.
Like a neo-resonance or a rebirth. It's like twice over.
Right. And the trick of that is obviously you have more freedom of information. You have more freedom of information, and the information is more abundant, but in a way that almost obscures the information a little bit more. It makes it harder to discern.
Yeah, because we're in a time where it's like hyper informative. There's too much information, and we as a Geist have kind of recognized this, and we call it misinformation and disinformation and fake news and stuff like that.
Because I think if you were a practitioner of magic trying to learn about these things, let's say the scenario was like you and I who kind of picked it up early in life, maybe you had like one or two books that you kind of treasured, and this was probably true more like 30 years ago before the age of the internet. Anybody who wanted to tackle these things, they maybe had one source, and it was a lot more rare than it is now.
Yeah, or
they would just read over
or one relative that was distant or had died recently that was connected to those sorts of traditions that went underground.
Yeah, they do tend to do that. They tend to go underground a lot with this information. And if you want to look up anything, you can watch us, listen to us talk about it, or you can click on 500 other videos on the subject at this point. That wasn't true even like 3 years ago on the internet. Nobody was talking about magic at the volume that they are now, or even old philosophy for that matter. And I mean, like, not ancient philosophy as it's taught in school, but I mean, like,
Gnostic philosophy,
Aristotelian philosophy, really deep dives into the nature of the world, the cosmos, the supernatural.
Gnosticism is especially interesting to me because it was a Christian sect of Hermeticists or magicians, mystics. And then they, like, over time they just committed suicide because they thought it was heretical.
They did. I said that the purge of information began slightly after Orthodox Christianity. I believe there was a branch between the Gnostics and the Orthodox, but more or less ideologically they were mostly in agreement for a time. But those are the kinds of traditions and Christianity that died out very, very early. And ironically, those were the ones who were closest to the time of Christ. They were the ones who got the information fresh off the press. Or the tablet,
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's very ironic how that happened, but it just goes to show there are traces of this even in the DNA of Christianity and Catholicism now.
I think we also should probably go over, at least briefly, the distinction between magic with a C and magic with a K, because I think a lot of people get confused on this, and I did at first. I was like, "What's with the K?" And like that was one of my first questions. What's with the K?
Yeah, maybe you can enlighten me more than I could enlighten anybody about it, because I thought it was more of just the K was more of a, what's the word? It's not honorific, but it was like a distinction between magic as a serious practice. As stupid as this sounds, like, to me, I thought that the K was just added on to just let people know, at least over text, like we are talking about the actual tradition of magic as it was practiced in real life.
I think that has merit to it. I think that might be probably the biggest distinction for that. Like magic with a K is referencing basically Hermeticism.
This is a good segue into magic with a C for me.
Yes, and I did want to talk about magic with a C just briefly before you.
Yes,
magic with a C is, I would kind of define it loosely as illusory entertainment. Or like, Plato's cave, the shadows on the wall.
Right.
The internet is a pretty good proponent of modern magic with a C.
Right. So how would you define that? Would you say that there are people who think that they are like practicing something else, but they're actually practicing this magic with a C? Because I actually want to hear this out. Or am I getting that wrong?
I think it's slightly wrong, but what I mean by magic with a C is bigger entities like entertainment corporations and entertainment industries. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, as far as like entertainment industries, yeah, when I think magic with a C, I definitely think magic as like a literary device. I think it thinks a lot in terms of like literary structure. Magic with a C, I think there's something beautiful about the literature that we tell that has like magic, and I'm talking about like Lord of the Rings,
Skyrim,
video games,
Skyrim,
stuff
like that.
Mm-hmm. Because and Full Metal Alchemist, that's one of my favorite modern medias, because it's one of the first, not the first, it's one of the best examples of a hard magic system. So the difference between a soft magic system and a hard magic system, at least in literary terms, is soft magic, the rules are very loose, undefined. It's not unusual to see somebody, like cast a firestorm or like summon a thunderstorm. That's a soft magic system where it's very much laissez-faire. But in Full Metal Alchemist, I'll just use this as an example, and I don't want to talk about that, but they were using Hermetic souls and Full Metal Alchemist to transmute like anything that they wanted. So it was a long and drawn out process. There was a lot of rules as to what you had to draw, how you had to do this ritual, and I think because the rules were so rigid, it was almost treated like a science. Reality is somewhere in between this. When you're getting into Hermetic philosophies and getting into old magic, ancient magic, the powers are very much literal, I believe, but in a way where the rules, there are certain laws that are immutable in nature that have to be followed. So, magic in real life, magic with a K, kind of plays this balancing act, or like it does this dance between hard magic in fantasy and soft magic in fantasy, where it's almost treated like a science by the people who really, really treat it with respect as a tradition. And people do this all the time. They always have.
Yeah, and I think something that is a bit related to this is the distinction between exoteric and esoteric. And this was like a relatively new thing I discovered I didn't really know what exoteric. I knew what obviously esoteric. I think everyone knows what that's supposed to mean.
Yeah,
exoteric is kind of...
That's a buzzword that kind of gets thrown over.
It's a lot less known. But exoteric is like the Bible, in the sense that like the Bible is just an encoded history of magic and Hermeticism, basically.
Oh, are you talking about back speech?
Yeah, front speech, back speech, exoteric, yeah.
So, okay, so they're synonymous.
To my knowledge, yeah.
I suppose exoteric and esoteric speech. This is a really good lesson in discernment, which is absolutely necessary at the very, very beginning of anyone's journey into magic, is discernment. And I'll say like this about like the community, I suppose. I saw this a lot more like during the years of the pandemic when people were like doing readings on Twitter. I saw a lot of that, and it was partially because they were locked down and it was a way to kind of make money. But one thing that witches and spiritualists would do when they posted mass astrology readings to people, which is like trying to predict your future or trying to like see how your ex felt about you, they said, use discernment. I think it became sort of a dirty word for a little bit, because
or trust
discernment,
your intuition.
Yeah, trust your intuition. You know, if it doesn't apply, leave it. And that was a little bit deceitful, I think, because the way it was being used. So when I say like use discernment, and I'm trying to sell a product to you, which is essentially just mediumship and divination.
Yeah, it's basically like snake oil, almost.
Snake oil, yeah, and it's not to say that these people weren't even really good at what they did. They were making money off of it, certainly. I don't imagine they were making that much off of it. I mean, some people got like really popped off for a very small amount of time. But it was the responsibility of the thing that was being chipped off. It was like, you know, if you get overly emotionally attached...
Tarot, like the popularization of tarot was a good example.
Tarot, yeah. This is primarily happening with tarot card readings. So, like, if it doesn't apply, you know, and you get emotionally attached to a certain outcome, and what I say turns out not to be true, you know, while they're basically mass tweeting to, like, maybe thousands of people, it's not my fault from that point on, you know? Like, you need to be discerning. I think that was a very valuable lesson.
And I think the same thing was also kind of found on YouTube, at least I saw it, where random videos in your recommendations would be like, you know, if this video is in your suggested, you are chosen, or you need to listen to this news right now, it's so urgent, you know, and it's just like, we all know what you're trying to do. Yeah,
that was another thing that really muddied the waters of online divination, was social media algorithms. They would gear you towards certain keywords. So you, of course, would hear what you wanted. Yeah, you would, of course, hear what you wanted to hear. You would get affirmations for whatever you wanted if you watched enough content.
Yeah, and that's the kind of grand deception or the fake news of our age.
Yeah. So, discernment, to me, is one of the most important things when it comes to magic, because we are talking to you right now, trying sincerely, like without sounding ridiculous, to say that magic is real and we want to keep that channel going. You know, there's no way to make that believable to somebody who isn't, you know, wanting or ready to hear it in some way.
Entering the world of magic and mysticism, I think it kind of comes with the territory. As soon as you enter that world, you've entered into a world of mirrors.
Yes.
A world of smoke and mirrors, and it's just like you don't know what to do or where to go. And so like you'll think, if I just make it up as I go along and I don't get killed doing it, I must be doing something right.
Yeah. And these things aren't even particularly dangerous, but there's a lesson in that. There's a lot of deception out there, and people with a very sincere want to learn need to make sure that they're getting their information from very viable resources, and more than anything, more than any teacher, more than any textbook, more than any tradition, trusting their own gut and their own intuition. Because that's going to be, for you personally, like the make or break kind of element that decides, do you get really good at this or does it kind of sweep you up? It feeds you that false information.
That, I guess, sort of begs the question, well, what are the good resources for Hermeticism? What are the texts that I can actually read, that I can depend on? And this is something I've been really struggling with for like the past couple of so years. And I think there are reputable sources of information, but in a sense, you kind of can't trust your gut. I mean, yeah, trust your gut, trust your intuition. But if that's all you got, I'd say, advise a little bit differently.
Yeah,
adjust
and
accordingly,
I would say
rather.
I would say that the adjustment that you need is a sort of literacy. So we were talking about front speech, back speech, exoteric versus esoteric.
Mm-hmm.
There's a certain literacy, an immense importance placed on symbolism, allegory, and metaphor within, which exists pretty consistent within all these, as we see, credible sources for Hermeticism. And you cannot divorce them from their historical context, which is why you almost have to learn about history and Hermeticism. They're not really separable.
And
Just
in a way,
if you want to get
science
to
too.
the truth of a religion. Yeah, I think that's the real unique
And
attribute about Hermeticism. Yes. So everything that makes us human and intellectual, essentially, gets wrapped up into one nice package.
And in a way,
Speaking of which, I was going to say, it's like credible sources, they tend to compile multiple books into one, like the Corpus Hermeticum, and maybe you know about more.
the texts that I have been able to depend on have been the Hermetica, and the Kabbalion, the Emerald Tablet, and I think these were good starting points to sort of decode the traditional Orthodox texts, but I do think the information is still in the Orthodox texts, but it's encoded, like we said.
All right. And what were you saying earlier?
About what? Oh,
there was something that you were trying to say earlier.
The Hermetic. I was going to say, in a way, Hermeticism is like the great synthesizer of information in kind of philosophy, or ways you should live your life in general, because you have to learn not only what these elements are, but you'll have to make some of them yourself in the right ways, and you'll have to learn how the ancients did it. So you have to learn history, you'll have to learn the other studies of orthodoxy, you'll have to learn the Eastern thoughts, Eastern mysticism. I mean, it's important to learn all of these traditions, science too, the secular tradition, because they all contribute to Hermeticism, even if they don't.
Alchemy.
Even if they don't want to.
Yeah, alchemy was just the medieval.
The Kabbalion goes into this. Yeah.
Chemistry. Yep, it's just chemistry. When people are talking about alchemy in history, they're just talking about what we would call chemistry today. They just had different theorems, and they were on a different point of progress than we were. In fact, one book that I have right in front of me is, sounds pretty straightforward, but it's a 200-page book called Alchemy by Titus Burckhardt. If you can find information that's written by maybe 20th century scholars who are translating this information for modern digestion, that definitely helps a lot as well. It helps to have a pair of eyes that were looking at these old texts and sort of trying, at least, translate them in ways that modern people would understand.
And I think one of the Hermetic axioms that's found in the Kybalion, and keep in mind the Kybalion was probably only made in the 1930s, channeled by I can't remember his name, but it was supposed to be written in the 1930s, not really an ancient work. But even in this, there's a lot of Hermetic axioms that can be found in ancient works. But one of the first ones is, the lips of wisdom are closed except to the ears of understanding. To the people who aren't really going to pick up on these things, it'll just be words, and it won't mean anything, or they'll take the meaning and they'll strip it and use it to stroke their ego in some way.
William Walker Atkinson.
That the name of the author of the Kybalion? The
Yes.
possible one? I don't think it was ever confirmed that it was him, but I think that's supposed to be him.
Oh, they're so mysterious when they write these things.
Yeah. Because the amount of encoding they do is like, that's why you have to learn all this kind of stuff.
They even have to encode their name.
Or else they will die. I mean, in like the Puritan era, they would have died.
Yeah, that has a lot to do with it. You could be punished for this information, for sure, in the past. We're very lucky to be able to kind of talk about it publicly.
Killed, yeah. You
Which
just
means
get killed for heresy.
Yeah. Imagine getting killed for heresy. I can't.
I would never.
Not today. That brings me to my next point. So you were talking about, one thing that you have to be prepared for is, no matter how you go about it when you first read the texts, they're going to be throwing around keywords that almost would make no sense to a person who, they say that in magic that a person is initiated when they begin to, understand the allegories that are being made. So I'll try to flip to a random page and see if I can find something to kind of illustrate this point for what I'm getting at. Here we go. Materia. This is an excerpt from another book, I believe, and the one that I just talked about, Alchemy by Titus Burckhardt. Materia prima, which can produce the form of the elixir, is obtained from one single tree, which grows in the lands of the West. It has 2 branches, which are too high for anyone who would eat its fruit to reach without labor and effort, and 2 others whose fruit is drier and more wrinkled than that of the former. The flower of the first of the 2 branches is red. The flower of the second is between white and black. The tree has 2 further branches, which are weaker and softer than the first 4. The flower of the first of these 2 branches is black, and that of the second is white and yellow. This tree grows on the surface of the ocean, just as other plants grow on the surface of the earth. Whoever eats of this tree is obeyed by both men and genii. It is the same tree that which Adam, may peace be upon him, was forbidden to eat. When he did eat of it, he was transmuted from an angelic form into a human form. This tree can transmute itself into the form of any living creature. So when they're talking about that, they're not at all talking about a tree. They're hardly even they're not talking about a tree that grows in the ocean, or a flower that literally turns red or white or black. We can go more into the symbolisms of that in maybe another episode, because that's a loaded subject on its own.
The world tree, tree of life, Yggdrasil. It's
Right.
found in almost all religions.
And if you were going to take that literally, that excerpt, that would be front speech. If you literally were thinking a tree in the ocean and red, white, black flowers, that's not necessarily good enough to understand the back speech, the allegory that it's actually making. That honestly comes with time. That there's no way to... There's just so much of the information I mean, people were spending their whole lives studying this kind of thing, and we are kind of blessed to be able to go through it as quickly as we can with enough dedication and enough mind power, um, and open source information. But that's symbolism. It's how things like the Bible become misinterpreted and separated from the back speech.
Yeah, and I was just going. That segues perfectly into what I wanted to say. Is I have my own experience uh, bleeds into the Jehovah Witness crowd.
Really?
Yeah,
Hmm.
my step grandmother is, I guess she's still alive, um, a Jehovah Witness, and from what I could gather, I mean, I was very young whenever I was around her. For what I could gather, they believed in biblical inerrancy. And if you don't know what that is,
Hmm.
biblical inerrancy is like whatever the Bible said really happened. So like the flood, the great flood, that really happened. Revelations, the politicians who are supposed to like be locusts with human heads, that's coming. You know, the rapture's coming, that's going to happen. Jesus is going to come down.
Yeah.
They all thought these things, and they had completely separated front speech from back speech, exoteric from esoteric.
Wow, on purpose too.
Yeah, for their own gain. And that kind of goes into what we were saying about the Twitter psychics.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, you could easily see politicians with the head of locusts. You probably, I mean, you can intuitively pick up what kind of metaphor that's talking about.
Yeah, and I think
But, like, they
people
didn't
do.
even, wow. They didn't even, like, try to discern from
Some
fact
people,
or
some
allegory.
you
Some,
see, that's
some
the thing. Some people, some Christians will identify the esoteric speech, but they won't know how to interpret it because they don't have anything else to guide them besides Christianity.
Yeah, I would say like that's kind of what I like about the crowd of Christianity. Actually, I mean, I honestly like. Besides, I acknowledge the history, and I know that it's really responsible for a lot of the problems that we have in our particular field. That is like the history of religion. How are you going to study the history of religion if most of that information that conflicted with some sort of
Comes from one.
central dogma, yeah, it got burned. It all got destroyed. Um, and then it got interpreted, however, whether they cared to do so. But I don't know, I forgot where I was going with this.
You were talking about, I think it was supposed to go into exoteric and esoteric.
Oh, in many Christians, I see I don't know if they know this or not, but I do see a desire to understand the Bible and to understand how God works on a deeper level.
And
But it's about what kind of resources that you have, and who has a vested interest in making sure that you don't do so.
that is also a good transition into
Yeah.
what is God? What is divinity?
I think so. There's a practice called Kabbalah in Jewish mysticism, and it's not an exaggeration. The whole practice of going through this journey is literally to try to understand God, and that means being in God's head, the Godhead, experiencing the world as God.
It's usually in more esoteric circles called the Empyrean, the mind of God.
And like, yeah, and as I said, it's not an exaggeration. I mean, I believe this is the Philosopher's Stone in allegory.
Mm-hmm.
They just want to. You obviously can't do this and be in a human body, right? It's something that you can't comprehend. But there are personal, living today reports that you may trust or you may not, who do these practices, and there have been plenty throughout history who do these practices and who have experienced that complete disintegration of the self. to know, even just for a moment, what it was like to be in God's head, and they realized that's what they were doing all along. That is the thing that we go back to, I suppose, when we died. Not that we were ever really separated from it, because they realized that it was always within all along.
Yeah, apparently that can even be sensed before birth, or at least during infancy. Some doctors and biologists call it the oceanic feeling. You heard of that?
I have not.
They call it the oceanic feeling because the baby cannot describe itself from the world. It literally doesn't know anything. It thinks it is the world. It doesn't have a body.
Oh wow! So this is shortly after birth.
Well, I think during infancy. It's
okay.
during like the first few years where the baby isn't really conscious of its awareness, surroundings, and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think I did that.
And apparently, some secularists don't really like it.
I bet not. But I believe it. That makes sense, because the Buddha was trying to return to this. The entire process of enlightenment is like trying to go back to that state of not being separate at all from the world around you, the natural world, and your environment, and God, ultimately. And adults who achieve enlightenment, they just know better. They know better because they know that at one point they had felt separate from it. They had not been enlightened for a time. So they have the reference of both. But I think as we develop personalities and ego and instincts that serve the purpose of survival, we need to create an identity to protect in order to preserve ourselves. That would probably be the separator. I don't think babies have that. I don't think infants have that.
At the same time, like what you said was true about the survival instinct and building the self. But at the same time, in order to be any sort of efficient mystic, you have to go through ego death. And that's actually a lot harder than it sounds.
Yeah, and a lot of people say that they have gone through ego death. Ego is not necessarily your enemy.
It's not. But
it's the thing that makes you eat.
It's almost like you have to dissolve it in like almost like a purification sort of exercise.
Right. I would say that the ultimate ego death is that moment when you actually do become one with the mind of God. And I say this because a lot of people think that the word ego has kind of become divorced from its original meaning. So a lot of people think that ego death is like, taking psychedelic substances for the first time and learning not to be an asshole. And it's like, yeah, that's part of it. That's trimming the fingernail that is the ego.
Mean, psychedelics is certainly, to put it in a symbolic kind of way, like nitro. It's nitrous.
Yeah, but I'm telling you, that bastard ego is really hard to kill. That's its job, is to be hard to kill.
Oh yeah, because whenever you wake up the next day, it's still there.
Yeah, you have to eat. If you're eating, you have desire. If you have desire, you have an ego. And you cannot be here in this world without a basic survival instinct to eat.
Another word besides magic and ego that people get confused is God itself. God himself. God is supposed to be a man, right? A man who created the universe.
Like the sculptor who created a clay pot, a piece of art, and then stepped away from it. Now the creator, the sculptor, is here, and the piece of art is up there. That's one of the primary boundaries that keeps us from understanding, I think.
Yeah, and honestly, that's a really... How we approach this is honestly really tricky, because a lot of people, most people, are very set in their beliefs, and they don't want to let go of their beliefs.
You know,
But they have to.
They have to, but they also feel like to survive, they need to hold on to the thing that makes their identity, which, if you're not careful, becomes your beliefs, becomes your religion, becomes your tradition. It can even become magic. Magic can become your identity just as easily, if not more easily, than a regular religion. People break from religions all the time, but magic makes you feel powerful. It's almost like hard not to get an ego boost from that. So people,
and that's
get
felt
attached to these things all the time.
That's felt by both the pious and the pagans. And
Yes.
they both can feel the divinity,
Yes.
but they interpret it way in the opposite directions.
Right. Yeah, your conquistador that's burning people at the stake is really no different from your witch that's casting death curses because she wants to protect her beliefs or something like that, Essentially, that's the same feeling. It comes from the same insecurity.
The preachers of the prosperity gospel are no different than the psychics that you see on TV or on Twitter.
I would love to talk about the history of that. I have a whole essay typed up about prosperity magic and its roots.
Oh, I done struck a nerve.
Yeah, I'm very passionate about this one, sorry. Don't get me on a tangent, that will actually last for an hour. What about Taoism? How does Taoism differ from monotheistic religions in general? The separation that, like, the clay pot is here and the sculptor is now over there, he's walked away from it. Or the Taoist philosophy that everything is one and it was never separated to begin with.
There's a small story that I really liked. It was told by Alan Watts. I remember I was listening to one of his speeches, and he said that one of the Tibetan Buddhist masters, asked his disciple, get up and walk across the floor. Or walk across the room, rather. He got up, walked across the room, came back. The master said, "Now where are your footsteps?"
Now where are your footsteps? I gotta think about that. Is that it?
Yeah, that's it.
Now where are your footsteps? Oh, I like that one.
And I think it really compares the Eastern versus Western ideas of divinity and God, because in the Eastern tradition, God is a flowing, a process. Where are your footsteps?
Mm-hmm.
But in the Western thought, God is a king, a maker, a creator,
Lord God,
that you must worship or you will go to hell, and that is there's something
the
demonic about that in an ironic twist of fate.
Because that archetype of the father can get twisted.
Yeah, father
into
to the
a
tyrant.
Yeah. Yes, and I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, the original Hebrew word for God. When the Hebrews were trying to ask God, "What is your name? What do we call you?" God simply said, "I am."
The nameless one.
Or he said, "Yeah, I am what I am." And he said, "Okay, well, we gotta call you something, but we'll treat this name as sacred. We won't utter it unless we absolutely have to, or we're referring to you in a holy text, or what have you."
The Buddha said the same exact thing.
Mm-hmm. And the word was Yahweh. YHWH.
YHVH, yeah.
What that translates to, it's a breath. It's an inhale and
really?
Exhale.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Yahweh. And you can kind of hear it when you breathe. Yeah, I found that interesting because Yahweh means breath or wind, roughly, and it's not like, Yahweh is the name of God, but where that word comes from is referring to the intake and the outtake of air.
The
God
Buddha,
breathes in and the world is here, like the world is made, and then breathes out.
yeah, the Buddha, describing nirvana, describes it as the blown out state, the sigh of relief, the weight that gets lifted off your shoulders whenever you realize that you don't have to live. And some people find that really, really scary.
Yeah.
And that's the whole first step to the journey. And I think that might honestly be a very good place to stop. We're approaching 50 minutes.
Perfect. All right. Well, that was a good takeoff, I think.
I think that went well, yeah.
So if you would care to learn more, once again, about Hermeticism, philosophy, religion, the history thereof, and mysticism in general, we'll certainly be putting up more episodes, and all are welcome who may find value in this. Newcomers, adepts, intermediates, and even the intellectually curious.
Alright, this has been Jorius.
And I'm Silas.
And this has been the Hermetic Link, the introductory episode.
Thank you for watching if you've made it this far.